as a psychologist, a teacher, a clinician, and a mental health administrator. He counts among his interests language, human development, and history. And these days he is most active in OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the university. Will, it's all yours.
Well, my title is Don't Leave Out the Ones Who've Left. And at a time when millions of people half a world away are having to flee their native land, we may aptly discuss the topic of emigration, considering what this activity may involve, what it may indicate about people, politics, and our human condition, as well as American history. This topic connects with the peculiar properties of people as their own natural resources, as discussed by Bob in our last meeting. We're continuing a version of that particular quirk of his interests. America is its people, those who live here, including those who have come here from someplace else, but it's also those who have left for another place. None of us decided when or where we would come into this world. The throw of the gestational dice that determined where we were born was not in our own infantile hands. Once given our place of birth, we may have experienced factors, less or more under our control, that have changed our address and brought us to our own current abode right here in this location where we are members of our local and international torch club. Where in the world, in functionings or feelings, does any of us most truly belong? What goes on when people leave the place that they have called home and move on to another strange or even foreign location? How do they carry out the transition, and how can that turn out for them? Our human species, with its instrumentally augmented bipedality, has shown a powerful exploratory impetus that has spread our kind all over much of the surface of this earth, making our habitat as global as humanly possible, with increasingly mechanized transportation and communication. This is balanced by our burgeoning domestication, with constructed houses, furnishings, and fixed patterns of activity that link us to where we work. But even the most elaborate and well-furnished abode and the most anchoring activities can be subject to relocation. We not only get around our home area, visiting other places transiently, we may emigrate from where we live and immigrate to another spot, crossing geographical, cultural, and political borders on the way. We have thus become simultaneously less and more self-portable, and we have developed to one degree or another some compound of devotion to or distaste for our own neighborhood, community, state, country, and civilization. Socrates of Athens is reported to have preferred drinking a lethal dose of hemlock to leaving his city-state as an exile. And unidentified others may have shuffled off this mortal coil because they simply can't endure living where they are and haven't stumbled on any expedient of finding a more tolerable habitation. We like to think of America as a nation of immigrants, playing up our country's attractiveness, the migratory pulls to this land. We downplay or even criticize acts of leaving and the pushes resulting in emigration. We do not typically view ourselves as members of some great American diaspora. Immigrants may be heroic if they're not criminal. Immigrants are suspiciously less than admirable, perhaps even Benedict Arnold's. Our Statue of Liberty welcomes arrivals, but does not have a backside which proclaims, "Don't let the doorknob hit you going out." At best, we may assume out of sight, out of mind for any of our fellow citizens. At worst, good riddance. Although immigrants from the United States equal as much as a third, this is questionable, of the number of immigrants, including immigrants that return to their native lands, scholarly studies of immigrants within the human sciences approach about 1/10 of the studies of immigrants. Our federal government stopped recording immigrants officially in 1956. Although the Department of State in 2016 estimated 9 million Americans living abroad. That sounds like maybe a small number, but consider that it's several Nebraskas worth of individuals. Wikipedia provides a running count of countries that they have gone to. Also, where do Americans emigrate to, 1978 to 2020, provides a running year-by-year graphic of where they've gone. It's bing.com/videos. A Gallup poll of January 2019 reported that 16% of Americans, including 40% of women under age 30, said they would like to leave the United States. If we are proud of the quantity and quality of our human imports, it might be valuable to pay a little attention to our people that have self-exported. Any accounts of acts of migration are potentially moving stories, typically multifaceted ones, with all the challenges to a particular individual, couple, family, or group of leaving one place and getting to another. Understanding all that is going on, mundane or dramatic, has to be Janus-faced, balancing and synthesizing the various emigratory pushes from some point of origin, and thus retrospective, as well as immigratory pulls to some future destiny, and thus prospective. Analogously, we admire pictures not only because of their highlights, but also because of their shadows. We appreciate music not only because of the sounds, but also because of the silences. And sculpting achieves form by adding some substance, but also removing it. This paper has been formed not only by putting words on a blank page, but also by paring them away editorially. Just as remembering and learning are combined in our progression from past to future in time, so emigration and immigration are inherently related as people move from a previous location toward a novel one in space. Every immigrant has been an emigrant first, and every emigrant becomes an immigrant somewhere. How does migration relate to history, geography, culture, including economics and politics, not to mention language, climate, and even psychology? The surface of all these facets has barely been scratched and would require multiple volumes or blog sites or podcasts yet to be researched. There's really remarkably little evidence. Let's glance at a few prominent combinations of pushes and pulls in America's history. Pushes dominate when losers leave. When push comes to shove, those who are pushed may have been shoved out, maybe even as exiles or refugees, if the pushes are blatant enough. As our country came into being, this fate has predominantly characterized our Aboriginal population, who had engaged in their own conflicts over Lebensraum over the centuries, even before any Europeans arrived on the scene with their horses, guns, germs, and steel, establishing and expanding their original colonies. Native inhabitants were confronted with the radically novel notion of land ownership, the very idea, and forced, perhaps with a modicum of temporary legality, to emigrate from where they lived, as in the Cherokee Trail of Tears, or to resist such emigration as in the Cheyenne Autumn. This migratory impetus was given a boost by the American Revolution, not only for the Native Americans who had the misfortune of getting involved, but for anyone afflicted by Tory or Loyalist leanings. And that's some 20 to 30% of the British American colonists, including William Franklin, illegitimate son of Benjamin Franklin, who had been a colonial governor of New Jersey and was tossed in prison before he got exiled. These were often establishment types, as well as others who rejected military action or taking oaths. The success of the revolution resulted in the mass emigration of these loyalists, whether white or black supporters of the British cause when it lost, and whether to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, other parts of what is now Canada, England, Jamaica, or wherever they could go. A special case occurred in the efforts of escaped slaves who managed to get somewhere else, if not north via the Underground Railway or west to Mexico, then to some urban area in the same region, as John Hope Franklin has researched and found in his research. When our slaves were freed, some emigrated first to Nova Scotia, then to Sierra Leone and Liberia with little success, or Mexico or Jamaica or southern Trinidad, where they become Americans, and ultimately, perhaps, for some other Back to Africa project encouraged by whites like President Lincoln or advocated by blacks like Marcus Garvey. And a smaller version of the similar push-dominated process occurred when Confederates lost the Civil War. Some of them headed for places, predominantly Brazil, under favorable conditions, including legal slavery, provided by Emperor Dom Pedro II. Or like Captain Blunt, a character in Joseph Conrad's Arrow of Gold, who moved with his mother to France and supported with his sword the Spanish royal pretender, and with his own quaint code of chivalry kill the narrator of the novel in a duel. Another special case occurred when Japanese Americans were prevented from returning to the US after Pearl Harbor, becoming de facto immigrants against their original own intentions. Pushes were also prominent in the emigration of Vietnam-era protesters, who often got into difficulty with draft boards and mostly went to Canada or England or anyplace else. And similar conditions existed for Black Power leaders such as Joanne Chesimond, Pete O'Neill, Eldridge Cleaver, Stokely Carmichael, et al., who fled to places like Cuba, Algeria, Tunisia, Ghana, and Guyana. The most effective current incentive, God forbid, for emigration might be for our country to become a target for nuclear missiles, or for a new civil war to break out between the red and the blue states, or perhaps by a ramping up of the exercise of Second Amendment rights. Any radical split within our body politic opens the possibility for one faction may experience the kind of defeat or suppression that leads them to head elsewhere in hope of more congenial circumstances. Paradoxically, of course, the very conditions that make you miserable here may also make it harder for you to leave to go someplace else. And what is the cutoff point between the dissatisfaction that leads you to work to improve things and that which makes you just get the hell out of here? One may think here of the special bundle of attitudes and attempts, or peculiar, I think was my word originally, attitudes and attempts to remedy them that brought Jim Jones and his hundreds of followers to Jonestown in Guyana with ultimate suicidal outcomes. Turning now to pulls, any American may experience some ideal of an ancestral or cultural homeland, sensing traditional ties that make a person leave to be a returner, perhaps after generations, or even to get to places where we have no biological roots, only cultural aspirations. Americans descended from Europe have sometimes viewed countries from which their ancestors may have emigrated with a certain respect or reverence. They served as sources of civilization for American neophytes. Think of how the civilization of Europe, in contrast to that of their own native land, drew T.S. Eliot, Henry James, or Ezra Pound, to name three prominent examples who wrote about their experience in various ways. Or if you prefer, consider the Zionists who made Aliyah and took up residence in the homeland Israel as Olim. On the other hand, the prospect of encountering the mysterious unknown can have its own imperative attraction, with its own constructed or even fantastic Orientalism, as analyzed so well by Edward Said. The lure of the Orient may come from the Near East, perhaps as the cradle of monotheism, or the original target of the Crusades, or the Far East with its offers of mind-blowing mindfulness. any faraway place with a strange sounding name may exude a certain charm. Of course, any persons tempted by what is unfamiliar may get so restless when they become familiar with the initial one that they become tempted to move on or just to return. But someone like Lafcadio Hearn, born in Greece, raised in Ireland, and married and employed, married miscegenationlessly in Cincinnati, and a crack reporter in Cincinnati and New Orleans, may find an attraction to a strange place. In his case, America was ruled out, and not even the Caribbean, which he initially sampled, but Japan, which he clearly came to adore. American immigrants to Australia are typified, when you ask them, by their desire to explore an even newer continent than the one they left. Balancing the pushes and the pulls in migration is typically relational. Another place is attractive compared to some felt disadvantage of where you are now that links up somehow for you. The lost generation of the 20s, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Cowley, Sylvia Beach, etc., perhaps led on by Gertrude Stein, went to Paris because it offered some relative attractions, perhaps only je ne sais quoi, to aspects of staying in the United States, whether these might have been lack of prohibition, a favorable exchange rate, social attitudes, artistic or literary activities, or whatever, as in the special case of Joe Baker, Richard Wright, and James Baldwin, or the jazz saxophonist Dexter Gordon, all of whom felt more welcomed in France, just has had many Black World War I troops from the US, or Gore Vidal, more recently in Italy. There may be interactions with the individual's life cycle. Early uprooting may facilitate looser attachment. This is my psychological hypothesis. As in the case of Henry James, Gertrude Stein, and George Santayana, all of who had been transatlantically mobile in their early years. Of course, if you leave the US at too young an age, like Boris Johnson, that famous son of New York, the current British Prime Minister, you aren't even thought of as an immigrant, since it's presumed your leaving wasn't really at your own choice or under your own control. Boris was several months old when he returned and had another 3 years in the United States, but did it improve him? I leave that to you. Older emigration has its own paradoxicality, as in the case of snowbirds who seek the most clement, bucolic, or economical settings for their remaining years, cyclically or for good. Thus, the very process of getting settled in your abode as the span of your lifetime progresses now leads you to be faced with novel circumstances. Maybe a group of neighboring fellows can help if you can find a colony of them where you go. Of course, the pulls can rest in the intended effects on others, not what do I get out of it, but what can I provide for somebody else, one can emigrate to be of some benefit to those living where one moves via religion, technology, or military force. American missionaries have sometimes settled in the pagan lands they originally came to proselytize, as Adoniram Judson did in Burma and Pearl Buck did in China for a while. Congregational missions to Hawaii played a significant role in changing a set of whaling and trading stations into what eventually became our 50th state. Or take the case of Homer Lee, the physically deformed Stanford student who made himself a general. He just decided he was a general. And led the armed forces in Sun Yat-sen's Chinese Revolution. They needed a good American general. And after the American repression of the Philippines, a significant number of Americans, only some directly connected with the military, moved there. After World War II, American soldiers have been stationed for periods of time in places like Germany and South Korea, in some cases with potential long-term consequences. It has also been possible for Americans to make and save money in other countries by trade or employment, or simply relatively lower cost of living. Of course, it hasn't been necessary to actually go to or become a permanent resident of another country to organize financial dealing with it, as in the case of the early New England shipping magnates who managed to do so, with the kind of benefits so vividly described in passages of Jewett's The Country of the Pointed Furs. In recent globalization, migration has become not only international, but transnational, balancing the sending and receiving countries in a continuing nexus. Namely, you don't really leave and you don't really arrive. You just get there and tool around. Can we imagine migration gradually to resolve into unsettled cosmopolitan wandering with declining identification with any specific country, or with occasional space trips for variety? Climate change may be expected to provide an increasing impetus for migrations in the rapidly approaching future. Will increasing temperatures drive people to cooler, moister locales? They may well, out of reach of rising ocean levels on the coasts. Some of you know a lot more about this prospect than I do. Ultimately, when, I'm afraid not if, our Earth becomes uninhabitable, whatever descendants we have will be forced to look for some extraterrestrial home site and devise and construct the required means of transportation and life support. The radical emigrants will have won out and may need all the luck and technology they can get to survive the experience. Well, having mentioned this catch-as-catch-can assortment of issues with examples that have sprung to my mind, I'd be most interested in hearing about other factors that may be involved in emigration, or any other instances or counterexamples that may occur to you. Yes.
So how long
you're supposed to do that so it gets.
Yeah, so they can, okay, thank you. How long does one have to live in another country, or are there certain activities such as home? Maybe they're not owning homes in other countries, but how long does one have to be gone in order to be considered an immigrant with an E?
Very good question, and nobody has any way of answering that. There has not been the study. You know, it's arbitrary. You know, how long do you have to leave? You know, how much do you intend not to come back? All of those issues are unresearched that I've been able to find. People just set an arbitrary cutoff point, and they for whatever purpose, and then they say, "Oh, that's an immigrant." You know, how much of a border do you have to cross? Who knows? How long do you have to stay? You know, can you come back? Can you be an expat just for a while? And does that count as an immigration? We need to find that out, you know. And as long as we just concentrate on immigrants, we will never find it out. It's harder to do research on immigrants because they've gone someplace else. You have to chase them down.
So it seems like every presidential election in my lifetime, one group or another has threatened to leave the country if their candidate is not elected. Does anybody ever leave?
Certainly at the time of the American Revolution, it was fatal for thousands and thousands of people. But historically, people have left, and the same people or different people may have claimed that they would leave, but we don't know. I mean, it is more tempting to view with alarm the prospect of your opponent winning. And when your opponent wins, you may just settle back and say, oh, there'll be another election in 2 or 4 years, and bide your time. It can, you know, or you can say, I've had it, I'm getting out of here.
Yeah, actually, it is right now somewhat difficult to, if you're a U.S. citizen, to renounce your citizenship if you decide to move elsewhere, because the policy, well, the policy is that they make it difficult. There's actually an exit interview thing that you have to schedule with the State Department, and right now, because of COVID, they're not scheduling anybody. So, you know, if you even want to get rid of your citizenship, you can't.
Yeah, the technicalities can become daunting.
And especially for, you know, if you're a dual citizen or you were born in another country and a parent was a U.S. citizen, and you're stuck paying U.S. taxes, even if you have never been here.
It has consequences
there's all kinds of
various
issues.
sorts. But, you know, when Boris Johnson rose in the British hierarchy, he at some point just said, well, I was born in the United States, so technically I'm American, but never mind, I'm a Brit.
Actually, I did leave the country when Nixon got elected.
How did that turn out for you?
Well, I was an immigrant back to Europe, but here I am.
Okay.
2 years.
And when you emigrated, did you intend to stay, or did you just say, I'm going to leave now? The future is in God's hands.
I was attracted back to Europe. I thought I'd stay.
It's the pull of the ancestral
Yes.
home.
But it's too well. It's too well regulated for my tastes.
Well,
I
now
like some
now it
cases.
has gotten harder to emigrate in Europe because it's all one European community of nations. You can't even change your money when you go across one border to another. Being European has altered in the politics of it.
Sorry, I'm hogging the microphone before I give it to Jim. Very quickly, I wonder, if in many of these countries, we're seeing a rise of nationalism, and yet the majority of people for instance, in the USA have immigration in their background at some level. And I'm wondering if you read anything about the impact of nationalism on immigrants and or immigrants.
Well, it's a mixed bag, because on the one hand, there are more baffles set up politically for migration. And on the other hand, the world is getting smaller. So crossing to another nation is now either more readily done or less readily done, depending on which aspects you decide to emphasize. So nationalism, one feels, must have been reaching its peak during our lifetimes. How can we continue to be so interdependent without recognizing that the national borders are arbitrary? Well, they thought that in 1900, that there never could be a World War I, and they kind of missed it on that.
I was going to say, you're an optimist.
Yeah, well, I'm a observer.
We have a
Yes.
question from Robert online. How widespread is the knowledge of American immigration to Americans who have never lived elsewhere?
How much, I think it helps if there is some kind of incident of migration that you're familiar with. I don't know good data that says that, but my example of Gertrude Stein and Henry James says that if you grow up with the notion that borders can be crossed, you will more readily think, oh, borders can be crossed. Yes, Bob?
Was Liberia an example of a really major migration?
It was an example of a major push towards immigration, but it more or less came a cropper. At one point in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln brought 5 black leaders into the White House and said, you all are going to want to go back to Liberia when the Civil War is over. And they said, maybe not so much. And the few that did turn out to Liberia did not reach overwhelming success. A lot of them have a very hard time, but technically the big cities on the coast of Liberia are heavily influenced by the returning slaves. So you can emphasize either aspect of it. Peter Levitov was a Peace Corps worker in Liberia and said for him, the split between the ex-American city folk and the never American country folk was quite graphic in Liberia.
So thinking of the folks I actually know who've emigrated, I think all of them emigrated because they had retired and they thought their money would go further in Ecuador or Yucatan or somewhere like that.
That's a big feature.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. I was
and
wondering if that
also,
was common.
if you are tired of scooping snow, you may think that there are better places than Nebraska or Minnesota to settle. And it helps if you have a group of similarly retired Americans in the locale, so you can sort of mix around together. But yes, it is the case that some aspects of American life, money and climate, can be a late life push to emigrate. And it works out fairly good as far as I can tell.
Hello, I have a question. So after the Great Migration, where enslaved Africans moved across, after the Great Migration, where enslaved Black people moved to different parts of the United States, the resurgence of the KKK became a decision why a lot of people left and moved to different places. So after Birth of a Nation was released in 1912, my question is, did you find anything in your research that alluded to people leaving because of like racial prejudice and then moving to another place? So essentially moving twice based on race.
The various people that left sometimes had second thoughts and moved again. How is this working out for you? Well, not as well as I hoped. I'll try a plan B, and that has happened. But I think I would form a hypothesis that the harder things are for you in the country that you're emigrating from, the more likely it is that you'll just go anywhere and find yourself living in a place which has its own disadvantages too. So somebody like Lafcadio Hearn, who can adopt Japan with absolutely no background, just because Americans made life miserable for somebody who had married a colored woman, is, to my mind, extraordinary. Ordinarily, people aren't that good at adopting and really buying into a place that they've gone to just because they have to get out of the United States. Can it happen? That it turns out well? Yes, Lafcadio Hearn shows that it can. Does it always turn out well? No. And the great example of that, which is a horrible example, is the example of Jim Jones and Jonestown in Guyana. I mean, those people ended up with worse fate than they had even in California. If some of you can imagine a worse fate in California.
Bob, you had a guest. Would you like to introduce? Yeah.
Yes. Also, slight commercial. This is the New Yorker. Article called "Testing the Waters." Is an article called "Testing the Waters," and it talks about natural resources or resources being plaintiffs in law cases, like bays and trees and endangered animals and stuff. I brought some copies of this if any of you are interested. I do have two guests tonight. The first is familiar to you because she was one of my student responders last week, Rachel Herpel. She's here tonight as a prospective member. Rachel, as you'll recall, is the assistant director of the Nebraska Water Center and the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute. Did I get most of that right? And a great friend, and we'll be working on her through the summer. The second guest isn't here in person, but I think he is on the, he ended up in McCool Junction tonight through no fault of his own, I think. But anyway, his name is Robert Magola. Robert is a third generation Anglican priest from Uganda, and he's in his second year as the rector of St. Mark's on the campus. And I'm trying to get him, and next fall we're plotting to bring his wife, who's a Methodist minister in McCool Junction, to come as prospective members. So thank you.
All right, thank you. And Sam, would you like to introduce your guest again?
Two months in a row. My honored guest is Jocelyn Bullock, who, I think she likes the club. So, yeah.